And without further ado, I'd like to present Kim. Kim Richardson, she, her, is a trainer, consultant, and author of the official Federal Grants Prep Guide. Kim Richardson is a grant writing and grants management expert, serving a diverse clientele of nonprofits, public institutions, and government agencies. As president of Kimberly Richardson Consulting, she leverages over 25 years of experience to benefit her clients and has secured and managed over $120 million in grant funding. That is a huge, huge amount of money. We are so excited to be able to hear from you today, Kim. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. And just wanted to say I really appreciate being invited to speak to your audience. I really have a passion for agriculture, even though it's not what I do professionally. But, I'm glad to be able to bring the expertise that I feel like I have to the topic today. We work with several clients, both in the state of Alabama and across the country in Georgia and California, where we've helped secure USDA funding, pigment settlement funds, working with SAFON, the Southeast African American Farmers Organic Network in Georgia, working with farmers throughout the Southeast for beginning ranchers funding, helping secure here in Birmingham farm to school funding, as well as the relatively new USDA urban agriculture grant, and just in support of the work that we do through our company to support various efforts with just cash contributions, in-kind donations, pro bono work around a number of initiatives around our city and our state, just because I just appreciate what everyone does. And so with that being said, I'd like to just offer a little bit of a disclaimer before I launch into my presentation, which is that this presentation is primarily designed for nonprofit organizations that, or other grant eligible organizations that are going after grant funds. And I know that some of your audience may be individuals who are operating farms or managing farms and interested and may have come to this presentation. So I'll try to roll in some of that information just in terms of past experience and how we can promote like partnership with grant organizations as a subrecipient and different things that individual farmers might be able to do if they aren't currently affiliated with a 501c3 or other grant eligible organization. So with that being said, I'll launch into the presentation and try to keep it as simple as possible, but also for those who are listening in to feel free to jump into the chat. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer those as I go, as well as to save a little time on the tail end for Q&A. And so what we'll be talking about today are what grants are and the types of costs for which they can be used, how to organize your thinking and develop successful grant proposals, typical components that are included in a grants application, and then common mistakes and ways to avoid them, as well as if we have enough time to launch into some insights in the review process, which if you're going after grants, I think is one of the best things that you can do to make you a better grant writer, is to volunteer or sign up to be selected as a peer reviewer, whether that's through local efforts, such as with United Ways of Central Alabama. Their allocations committee is always soliciting volunteers for their allocations process, as well as submitting your resume and credentials to be considered by some of the federal agencies. We've worked with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the U.S. Department of Education for many years as peer reviewers on grant applications. And I think that's some of the best professional development that we can do just to see what successful grant applications look like. And so first, I'd like to talk about eliminating some of the myths, because we get calls every day, 365 days a year almost, just asking questions about how you can access grants. And unfortunately, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of harm that's been done thanks to the internet and folks who put out a lot of inaccurate information. And so the first thing that we get a call on almost constantly is that grants are used for business startup. And By and large, grants are not for that purpose. There are some grant opportunities. None of the information that I think I'll be sharing today is an absolute, other than sort of don't miss a grant deadline. But in terms of the myths, funders for the most part are looking to support grant eligible organizations that have a demonstrated track record of experience, they can help build capacity, or there are some other revenue sources to sort of start where you are, and then they're looking to come in and to invest. Now, there's all types of like Kickstarter programs and things like that are doing some more what would be considered to be prizes as opposed to grants for folks who are starting maybe an agricultural based business. But by and large, if you're looking at grants, they're going to be for eligible institutions, although USDA does and other funders do offer grants to individuals. And you really have to look at each grant opportunity on a case by case basis to look at the language included within that, the guidelines of that opportunity, to determine who's eligible to be applying. So just know that that's just the best place to start. A lot of people think that grants can be used for any purpose, and they cannot. They can't. And so each grant application, the guidelines will always include information about what they consider eligible costs, what money can be spent for. Typically, grants can't be used for things like food or, to feed people, or to, and not in the sense of growing food as an agricultural producer, but like if you're holding events and wanting to feed people to attend events. Often those types of expenses are included, as well as sometimes capital expenses. But again, you have to look at the eligibility of that particular grant funding opportunity to determine what they consider eligible and ineligible expenses. The other really important thing to remember is that one proposal fits. One proposal does not fit all. And so we've heard in the past, a lot of people will say, I developed a grant proposal and I submitted it to 10 different funders and nobody wants to fund me. Well, I think the first difficulty is that each grant application needs to be customized to that particular funder, because each funder has a different priority and interest in terms of what types of expenses they'll support, what their priorities and programmatic interest are, and things of that nature. So it's just really important to know that if you've done one application, you've done one application. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't develop one really strong proposal template that can be used as the base for each subsequent application that you submit, but just know that you should always be customizing each grant proposal as you submit it to a funder. Another thing that we also hear is that budgets need to be padded, sort of throw everything in the kitchen sink and see what sticks. And, that's a really sort of dangerous way to go about it, because most funders are going to ask you to provide a justification for why you need a particular item to fund a particular expense, and how did you come about calculating that cost? And they'll be able to tell, if the cost is reasonable just by doing a little bit of research. So the most important thing when it comes to thinking about how much do you ask for is to just think about what are your actual expenses, what are your actual costs, and then develop your budget from there. If it's a multi-year budget, you can make some projections for increase, like if it's a multi-year budget and you need to add in for the cost or include the cost of fuel. Well, we know that that's something that's constantly changing. So you could use an average of that. And then if it's a multi-year grant, you could maybe add in a little percentage of an increase, a 2 or 3% increase within each subsequent year to try to accommodate for the fact that it's an increase in cost, or the cost of food, or things like that. So just keep that in mind. And then the misunderstanding that deadlines are flexible. And I said, if there's anything that's absolutely not true within everything that I'm going to talk about today, it's usually that deadlines are not, unless there are really some extenuating circumstances. But knowing that a failure to plan and be able to submit information in a timely fashion is not grounds for an extension of the application deadline. And so just know that you should consider every deadline a hard stop that's non-negotiable, and to actually plan to submit your application, particularly if it's online, submit it prior to the due date. So that way, if you have any technical difficulties or run into any glitches, you have time to try to address that with the funder. And so in terms of what grants are and how they can be used, grants are a form of funding that is primarily awarded to nonprofit organizations, government agencies, school districts, faith-based organizations, even private companies. The world is large in terms of who's eligible. to meet and identified needs. And the key is that grants typically do not have to be repaid, as opposed to loan funds and other types of funding devices and strategies where it's an investment in your project, your mission, your services, your operations that is that links and matches with the mission and priorities of the person or the entity that's providing the funding. So best case scenario, if you do it all right, you won't have to repay any money. However, if you spend funds or grant funds on things, going back to the last slide, that it's ineligible to be spent on, they will ask you to repay those funds. And so there are some conditions under which you may have to repay funds. But if you are operating in compliance with the regulations and rules of the grant that you received, that should never be the case.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Is there a standardized rate of expected inflation for costs that funders sort of anticipate from year to year if you're asking annually?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. Is there a standardized rate of expected inflation that funders expect if you're asking for grants multiple years in a row?
Not in terms of inflation. I think a way, if you wanted to come up sort of with a formula to address that, you could look at a cost and sort of look at sort of a year average over a 3-year period or a 5-year period or a 10-year period, even depending on the expense that you were looking at, and then come up with an average that could be used as your basis for making that projection of inflation based on past history. When it comes to operating expenses like if you're using a private vehicle and you want to do mileage reimbursement, if you're including expenses where you have to do travel and you need to buy an airplane ticket or stay in a hotel or pay a per diem, you can go to the federal government's GSA website. That's GSA, and they do have standard rates for those types of standard expenses that are updated annually. So it'll be like 0.56 cents per mile if you're calculating travel reimbursement, and it gives you the allowable daily rate for hotels and for per diem based on the location that you're going to. And so some things are standardized in that sense, but if you're talking about, accommodating for inflation, I just based it on historical sort of differences in rates for the cost that you're looking at.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And so then in terms of who provides grants, there's a wide world of funders. There's government agencies like the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Health and Human Services, as well as state and local agencies. The city of Birmingham offers various grants through their mayor's office, as well as through the Department of Community Development, as well as state of Alabama grants. Then you have private and corporate funders who do their philanthropic work as part of their sort of corporate mission. A perfect example is Alabama Power Foundation, which is a local, corporation, but then they have their foundation side, which then takes a portion of their profits and uses that to invest in various projects that align with their priorities throughout their service area. And so my recommendation would be to think about any company that you regularly do business with to investigate to see if they have a foundation. So all the local banks have a philanthropic arm, Walmart, Target, Dollar General, Publix, the grocery stores, just anyone that you could be thinking of. The gas with the utility companies, they all tend to have a philanthropic arm that if you make the case that, hey, we're spending our company dollars, our business dollars with you, let's look into the ways that we can tap into some of these dollars by the funders who provide them. Then you have your local foundations, public and private foundations exist. So you could have a family foundation or a public foundation like the Community Foundation of Greater Birmingham, which covers like a 5 or 6 county area as part of their mission and part of how they're designed and set up. So there's a whole world. You can use some great tools like the Foundation Directory Online, which is my primary go-to resource in terms of identifying potential funders and doing research as a search engine. And also to know that local libraries, both the City of Birmingham's downtown branch and the Hoover City Library, I believe, are considered what they used to call cooperating collections. I think it has a different title now, but the Foundation Directory Online is a subscription-based resource, but if you go and access it through those libraries that are cooperating with that program, you can access those resources for free using the services that are available through your local library. So if cost is an issue, you can always pursue that route. That will save you some dollars. But I think you will have to access it on site. But that may have changed with the sort of transition to virtual, so much virtual programming through libraries because of the COVID pandemic. And then there are different types of requests. So you have general operating grants, which are sort of general grants that don't have as many restrictions, although they are still a restricted type of grant in terms of you can't just spend it on anything, but you can spend it on direct and indirect expenses. And these are really great because many funders focus on programmatic grants. And so they have specific limitations on wanting it to be related to implementation of a program, but that doesn't help you keep your lights on. That doesn't help you sort of handle your payroll. If you're paying people, that doesn't help you pay your utility bills, and so a general operating grant gives you the flexibility to cover all of those types of expenses, both administrative and programmatic, that would be related to your operations or implementing your programs. Probably the most common type of grant are program and service grants, programmatic grants, or project grants that are for a specific period of time, a 1-year grant, a 2-year grant, a 5-year grant. It's going to vary from funder to funder. That covers your program related expenses. So staff, equipment, supplies, even administration, with usually some limitations on how much of the programmatic grant can be used for administration and overhead. But those types travel, those types of related expenses are typically, and those are what are considered restricted, so that they're going to give you a budget and tell you as part of your grant agreement what you can and cannot spend funds on. You have capital grants, which are considered like large pieces of equipment. Large pieces of farming equipment would be relevant. If you needed to buy a tractor under a grant, that would be considered like a capital expense. It's also considered for buildings and large infrastructure. And so those are less common, but of course they absolutely do exist. And you're definitely going to have a track record of experience and sort of data to sort of lay out this type of investment, because it is typically a larger dollar grant award. Again, in terms of eligible expenses, this is not a comprehensive list, but these are the types of expenses that you can be thinking about including within your grant budget and your grant requests, from salaries to supplies and equipment. And the distinction between supplies and equipment by most standards, and typically, and especially by federal standards, is that supplies are things that cost less than $5,000 per unit. And then equipment are things that cost greater than $5,000 per unit. So a computer or a laptop, for example, or an iPad is considered a supply. It's not considered equipment for your program by most programmatic grant standards. Although, again, check the guidelines to see if they've got specific language in their guidelines for how that's defined. But definitely under all federal grants, that's going to be the standard. So even if you're buying 10 computers at $2,000 each, which would be a total cost of $20,000, because the unit cost of the laptop is $2,000, it's that $20,000 is still considered a supplies expense as opposed to an equipment expense, because it's per unit as opposed to the total cost. Contracts and subcontracts. And this is a really great way for those in the audience who are listening in, because maybe they're operating an individual farm and aren't necessarily affiliated with a nonprofit organization or other grant eligible type of organization. And so looking around your community to see who you can be partnering with, where you could be a subcontractor or a subrecipient of the grant funds that they receive, is also a really great strategy in terms of helping you secure it. And it can actually be, for some, the easier route to go, because you've only got to worry about implementing your individual piece that's related to the work that you do, as opposed to being the grantee where you have to be responsible for all of the reporting, all of the drawdowns, all of the administration, and things of that nature. So, that's one way that individual operators can look to secure grant funds as a subcontractor or subrecipient, either providing your expertise, doing production, any number of ways that you might be able to work with a grantee. Program-related travel is a related expense if you want to do some type of professional development, register for a conference, do some type of training that requires you to travel both locally or out of state, can also be an eligible expense. Evaluation, and there are some grants that are research focused, particularly under USDA, that are specifically sort of for this purpose, for research and evaluation, to determine like what types of methods are particularly more effective than others. And so in those cases, that's one example of areas where private operators are eligible to apply for grant funds, because they often make those types of research projects open to private businesses and for-profit businesses. Indirect costs and overhead expenses can also be included up to a certain percentage. Usually I'd say around a 10%. Sometimes you may see it as high as a 20%, unless you've got a negotiated indirect cost rate, which is a whole other category, and you could do a whole webinar on that alone. But just know, if you are going after federal funds on a regular basis, you could apply to secure a negotiated indirect cost rate, which could then be included within all of your grant requests. And then, of course, you have capital. A large part of the success, I think, in terms of preparing to work on a grant application is doing the prep work. And we also always talk about sort of the golden rule of grant making. We've heard the golden rule that many of us may have learned, like growing up as kids. If you grew up in the church like I did, you heard this all the time, and sort of that sort of principle of treat others the way you want to be treated. And when you talk about grants, there's this saying that says the golden rule of grant making is that he who has the gold makes the rules. And so if you don't want to abide by regulations, if you don't want someone to be dictating to you what you can and cannot spend money on, if you don't want someone to be dictating like when you have to do reporting, what type of data that you have to collect, then don't go after grant funds. It just comes hand in hand with the funding. And there are some funders that are beginning to recognize that their expectations have been a little bit burdensome in terms of all the expectations that they have for the organizations that they fund. And they're trying to roll some of that back so that it's not so much legwork, but at the same time, they also want to have the data that substantiates the investments that they make through the grants that they award. So they will have an expectation that you'll do reporting, that you'll collect data, that you have to have good record keeping. And so again, if you don't want to do those things, then, just sort of look there. There are many other opportunities for grant funding outside of grants. And that's also to say that grants should always just be one piece of your funding strategy. So if you are an organization that's all grant funded, it puts you in a very vulnerable position. So I don't make any of the statements lightly to say, you should be going after all grant funds. And sometimes, because of the conditions of an award, you may actually have to turn a grant down. And there have been some instances where we've actually made recommendations for a client of ours to turn down accepting a grant award that we've prepared an application for and had awarded, just because the conditions were just too stringent to be able to comply, particularly for the amount of money that they wanted to invest. So again, it's just one of those things that you have to assess on a case-by-case basis, but just be aware that, this just sort of comes with the territory in terms of funder expectations. And there's a whole lot of, if you want to be radical about it, there's a lot of things that I'm reading right now that sort of takes a lens and places it on philanthropy and talks about, when it comes to certain types of community-based movements and grassroots movements, like philanthropy was never really designed to be a vehicle that really sort of move forward these types of initiatives, and that, if you want to have that, it was designed as a wealth vehicle, and it continues to be a wealth vehicle. It's where corporations dump their profits. It's where wealthy people set up their donor advised funds and all of these things. So there's a whole other conversation that you can have sort of about the history of philanthropy and who it's designed for. But just know, again, that it just sort of comes with the territory. And so there are other options that you can explore if you feel like the funder requirements are too stringent for your taste. And so the first half of the success in terms of securing grant applications is preparing to make the ask and doing the research to make sure that your request is properly aligned with, again, the interests and priorities of the funders. And so we have what we call the 3 R's, which are research, review, and request. And so research is critical to ensuring that your needs match the funder's needs. So of course, you already know what your needs are and what you could use funding for. So the question is, are you identifying the right funder who also wants to fund those things and consider those types of projects and programs and expenses to be also their priority? And if you can't make that case, then submitting a proposal to a funder whose interests are incompatible with yours is basically a waste of your time and energy. And like, who has time for that? And so, so the thing is to invest your time in doing the proper research to make sure that the time and energy that you do invest in putting together a really well-written proposal is directed to the right audience. And so that's like half the battle. So knowing what the funder is looking for and submitting a proposal that meets their criteria is essential for success in the grants process. And then here are some resources that I just wanted to offer. And again, I can, this will be available as the recording. And so I'm okay with making the PowerPoint presentation available, but grants.gov, if you're looking for federal grants, like grants.gov is the website that you should be looking at, registered on, so you receive those notices, and that is updated daily. So what you saw yesterday, there will be some new things added today. And so it's one of those things that you just have to constantly be monitoring, which, yes, can be time consuming, but is necessary to make sure that something doesn't slip between the cracks that you could be eligible for. And all federal agencies are required to post their grant funding opportunities to grants.gov. So all of those solicitations that you receive where someone's asking you to pay for some subscription to get notifications of federal grant awards are unnecessary. Like, just register on this website. You can get that information for free. You can also reach out to your congressional offices. I know that Congresswoman Terry Sewell has a grants newsletter that goes out from her office that's compiled by her staff. If you get on that mailing list, they email it to you. I don't know if it's weekly or bi-weekly, but again, that's a service that she makes free to her constituents that won't cost you a thing. So again, before you think about, particularly if you're interested in federal grants, before you think about paying for a subscription service, think about those resources that are free. The foundationcenter.org, which I mentioned earlier, which is how you tap into the directory, foundation directory online. Again, that is a subscription base for you to, you can, if you subscribe to it, you can access it from home on your own laptop or at work. But you can also sign up for their free alerts. They have some free alerts that you can just sign up for on their website. That is, and the Foundation Center is more foundation focused, as the name indicates. They don't so much operate in the federal grants and government grant space. And so it's needing to do a combination of strategies depending on the type of funding that you want to go after, of where you need to be looking. And typically it's a combination of resources. So instead of just saying one place, unless it's federal grants, which that place is grants.gov, but if you want to look at all grant opportunities across all types of funders, then you're going to be needing to look at a combination of sites. GuideStar.com is a really good website because you can do research, and that's at its base level, free of charge. There are higher levels to which you can subscribe, but probably for the needs of the average person who's going after grants, the free base level is adequate. And it's a really good resource because this is where you can go to download the 990 form for any funder. So if you want to get their 990 form, see who they've been giving money to, see how much money they've been giving to those organizations that you make awards for, you can access the last 3 years of any funder's 990 form by going to their guidestar.com website. The Chronicle of Philanthropy is a journal. You can receive that digitally or in hard copy, and that is subscription based. And again, as well as your local library. I know like the city of Hoover has a nonprofit corner in their branch. If you're in Hoover or again, Birmingham, Public Library, which full disclosure, I'm a complete advocate of our libraries and do sit on our library, Birmingham Public Library board, has many, many resources that they can provide to support you in doing searches and identifying data, and again, accessing those subscription-based programs that you would otherwise have to pay for, and so that you can keep that money in your pocket. And so once you collect that information, it's just critical to begin that review process, because again, one funder's guidelines is one funder's guidelines. And so you want to look at their specific guidelines so that you can develop a proposal that's in line with their criteria and their funding pattern, as well as looking at your own internal organizational capacity to make sure that you don't set yourself up for failure by proposing something that's sort of out of line, out of context, outside of your capacity work, or at least finding the right partners to help you do the work. So that's just really important. And that's why, again, those 990 forms can come in so handy, because oftentimes you'll see an organization say, we provide grants up to $500,000. That doesn't mean they're going to award you $5,000, right? And so by going in and looking at their 990 form, you'll probably find in that kind of example where their average grant award is $25,000. And then maybe they've got one large entity like the Birmingham Zoo or the University of Alabama that they've given a really large award to. And so that's where you need to sort of become a little bit savvy in terms of how you interpret the grant guidelines based on what they say on their website, and then looking at how they're actually distributing their money and making grant awards and what the size of those awards actually are. So once you have that information, you need to make a request again that's in line, a reasonable request that's in line with the historical funding pattern of the funder, as well as sort of, again, your history, track record, and capacity as an organization. So for example, if you're an organization with a $10,000 operating budget, and that's been your budget since inception, it's highly unlikely that you're going to be able to go out and secure a $1 million grant. Because you just haven't been able, and that's no shade, to any like 10,000 organizations, $10,000 organizations are doing great work. But in terms of demonstrated financial capacity, you're not going to be able to document that within your application. And so in that case, you're going to work on building your capacity to secure larger dollar awards and work your way up eventually to that size grant award, and establish that track record and relationship with that funder, particularly if it's a local foundation, that you can increasingly go after larger and larger grant awards. The same thing applies if you're a relatively new organization. If you just secured your 501c3 in 2020, most of your grant awards are going to be under $10,000. Just because you don't have, again, that demonstrated track record of experience, you don't have the data collection and reporting that you're able to provide to be able to submit something to and substantiate to that funder that you have the capacity to do the work. And so it's sort of like thinking of it as a triangle of just at the beginning, you're going to need to build a funding base that's sort of broad and wide and contains probably a lot of smaller awards. And as you build your capacity and experience in that triangle, you'll eventually hopefully be able to get some of those larger awards, either as a direct grantee, as a sub-recipient on a partner's grant, in other scenarios. This is sort of a summary of what we call the standard components of a proposal. Again, every proposal is different, and so you're going to have to look at that, the funder's specific guidelines, to know exactly what needs to be included in your request. But if you're thinking about sort of building out an initial template that can sort of think about where you need to be starting before you even identify the funders. Sort of these are the key components that they'll be looking for in terms of the information that they'll be requesting from you as part of a proposal. The statement of need is really one of the most important sections of your proposal because it's where you make the case for making your request. It identifies the need to be addressed. It needs to be well researched with really compelling data. It needs to demonstrate that you have an understanding of the issue for which you're requesting funding. It justifies why you're providing the services and why the funder should support it. And it provides compelling, currently and widely accepted data and statistics, and explains how the service meets a community need. And so this is where you use your census data, you use publications from local agencies. Like right now, we're working on a federal family planning grant with the Department of Health, and we're using their publications with the community's disparity data that they generate to work that data into their statement of needs to look at securing that funding. Just looking at what are the reliable sources. And sometimes if you find that there is no source of data for the thing that you're trying to demonstrate, then you may need to develop your own survey to collect that data. And so there have been some cases in which just the information that we needed wasn't there. And we've worked with our clients to just sort of help them develop a survey for their populations to then be able to use that data to substantiate making the request. So there are a lot of ways that you can attack the issue, but the most important thing is just having really compelling information and data points that you can put in front of a person to capture their attention, in front of the person who's reviewing your grant, to capture their attention and to really be able to sort of say, here's why this is important, right? Not just because we think it's important, but here's the data to sort of substantiate and document that this is an important issue in our community. And so we've seen a lot of data that we use all the time with regard to poverty rates, like nearly a third of the population of the city of Birmingham live below poverty level, have incomes below poverty level. The majority of the city is in a food desert, and there's lots of data out there to document that, disparities around, obesity, the South being a stroke belt, all of these things. When it specifically comes to agricultural initiatives that you can pull in, there is more than enough data to make the case for whatever it is that you're attempting to do. As well as things that are related to, again, like disparities. The Black Farmers Census Survey that's put out by the USDA has some really compelling information. If you're a BIPOC farmer that's looking for information around, just sort of that decreasing trend of investment, the history of disinvestment, the history of discrimination among Black farmers and things of that nature. So, if you're looking for any of those resources, the information is out there. It just requires a little bit of digging to do that research to set up that stage for making the request that will follow. Your agency background and experience. And again, this is just a summary of just who you are, what you do, who you serve, where you're located, where your sites are. Do you have multiple sites? What are your hours of operations? It's basically the who, what, where, when of the request in terms of what your organization is all about, why you exist, who you serve, what you produce. And so that's one of those sections that once you write this section of the proposal, it really is one of those things that you're just going to kind of use over and over again, because the history of your organization doesn't change a lot, although you can update it. So new investments that are made, new partnerships, new accomplishments, new data in terms of your service utilization can come here. But for the most part, once you write this, it's a pretty solid piece that you can copy and paste throughout your proposals. Your program description, again, is the who, what, why, when, and where of what you want to implement, the project or activity that you want to implement. So again, who you're going to serve, your staff and its leadership qualifications or your credentials, where you want to implement these activities and what your approach or strategy is for implementing it. And particularly if you're working within a particular area, like do some research also to be able to make the case for whatever strategies or activities you're implementing. Is it aligned with like what they call evidence-based or evidence-informed practices? So the more that you can use to document is not just an activity that we're implementing, but it's something that there's been research on that's been conducted to confirm and it's been verified that this is an effective way to go about doing this thing that it is that we propose to do, only strengthens your proposal. So whatever it is, just look up, if you're working in agriculture, evidence-based practices for agricultural programs, evidence-based practices for community-based agricultural programs, evidence-based practices for whatever, for hydroponics, aquaponics, whatever it is that you're planning on doing, and see what comes up. And if there are components of your program that aligns with the information you find, then cite that. And that will definitely strengthen your request. Setting goals, objectives, and outcomes will always be part of the process in terms of the funder saying, what is it that you want to accomplish for the time period for which you're requesting funding? And there is a difference, even though sometimes funders get them confused, but in terms of being really clear on what it is and what they mean, we're going to focus on the definitions of the difference between goals, objectives, and outcomes. And so goals and objectives, there's a difference. Goals are broad statements, right? They're the results of what you hope to achieve. Objectives are the things that are measurable and set a standard for how you evaluate your success. And then the outcome indicates an anticipated change in condition, attitude, or behavior. So an example that we have here is that many times when it comes to the objectives, you'll hear what are called SMART objectives. And that just means that in order to write a good objective, your objective has to be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and it has a time frame attached to it. And if it meets those conditions, then that's considered to be a well-written objective. And so an example here that we just want to cite as a simple example is the goal, is the big goal, the big broad overarching thing. So the goal could be to increase home ownership rates in the city of Birmingham. And so an objective could be to increase the homeownership rate among Birmingham residents from 37% to 39% by 2021. And this would have been if you were doing it in the past. And so again, that requires knowing the data. So you looked up the census data or other data to say, what is the existing homeownership rate in the city of Birmingham? And then what's reasonable based on the amount of time that we have available to implement our activities? How much change can we expect to see? Like, how fast could you move something like a home ownership rate? It's one of those things that's going to be relatively slow. And so again, what's realistic and attainable is subjective depending on what it is that you're planning to implement. And so the way that your objective will be assessed is that you don't want to sort of overpromise and set yourself up for failure by setting an increase that's not, if you did this for 1 year, you'd probably say you wouldn't be able to accomplish that in the year. Maybe if it was a 10-year award, maybe that would be something that would be more reasonable in terms of attainability. So it's always that lens that you have to be looking to assess how much time you have available and what is the factor that you're trying to move or make a difference in that determines whether it meets that criteria of being SMART. Outputs, a lot of people like to focus here, and outputs are just levels of activity. So an output could be that 200 individuals receive home ownership counseling annually that helps move them towards home ownership. But again, the output is the so what. The activities are great. The question becomes, what kind of a difference are you making based on the activity? So that's where the outcome comes in, is that the purpose of increasing the home ownership rate is that you increase neighborhood stability, you increase community safety, you increase property values, which then have an effect on school districts, because of the way that school districts are funding. So that's the outcome. So it's the ability to tie all of these things together to then be able to make the case for what's reasonable to suggest that you're accomplishing for the time frame that you have available to you, and the funder is going to tell you exactly what that is, whether it's 1 year, 5 years, whatever the time frame. Just use that as the framework for how you make the decision for writing your goals and objectives. The budget is a really important part because it can make or break your proposal. Even if you have a well-written proposal, if your budget is terrible, they may give you a second bite at the apple to say, we really like your request, but we want to work with you on your budget. Or if your budget's just totally out of whack, they may just say, we're not going to fund this budget because the budget was inappropriate. And so most of the time, funders will not fund 100% of your grant requests. They're either going to have a specific requirement for how you have to provide match, or they're going to tell you they want you to identify the other leverage resources, and those can be both cash and in-kind resources you can cite as other investments in your program besides the one that you're requesting from the funder. And so knowing what those are, keeping a list of who your partners are and how they're investing in your program, is a really important piece of that, and particularly around identifying in-kind resources, because I realize that a lot of organizations are heavily volunteer funded, and that's great, and that's totally fine. The key is that if that is the case for your operation, then you want to be like tracking and documenting volunteer hours, because there is such a thing as the value on independentsector.org. I think .org or .com. It's further in the presentation. The link is there, but it gives you the value of what 1 hour of volunteer time, what is the sort of in-kind value of 1 hour of volunteer time. So if you have an opportunity where you have to provide a match on your grant, and it can be cash or in kind, and you're like, well, we don't have any cash to match this grant, but we do have the value of our volunteer time or other partners that are maybe giving space, that are loaning equipment, like assigning the value. And that's one of those things where you've got sort of a formula to be able to calculate what that value is and use that in your justification for how you're coming up with that match amount. Because you can say, we had 1,000 hours, we had this many individuals that provided 1,000 hours of this of volunteer time on our farm. And then now we're using this commonly accepted annual value of volunteer time to use that as a calculation for how we're determining our match, the value of our match. So again, there are strategies that whether you are cash rich or volunteer rich, or somewhere in between, you can use both a combination of the resources that are provided by your partner, as well as your partnering organizations, as well as individuals who might come in to support your operations. Sustainability is important because organizations are going to want to know after their investment ends, like how will the initiatives that they've sort of made provided funding for, how will that continue? They really don't want to hear that it's going away after their grant ends. They want to hear that you're coming up with some strategies. And all this is a projection. Like we can't guarantee that anyone will invest in our organizations or our operations in the future. But what we can do is say that we have a strategy for how we intend to secure additional funding. And that can come from a variety of strategies, again, from continuing to go after grants from additional funders, coming up with revenue generating strategies where earned revenue strategies where we're through our production. Now we're creating a product that then we sell for a profit that then goes back into our operations. And so that can become a source of unrestricted funding. And can it be tied with just some larger plan for how you continue to look at how you keep your expenses covered? And so, again, it's one of those things that's always a moving target, but you at least want to be able to demonstrate to the funder that you're giving thought to this concern, which is their concern, to know that if they make an investment today, that they're sort of laying a foundation or making an investment for an initiative that will continue going on into the future. Unless it's something that's emergency in nature, and funders will, have that clear understanding, and typically they won't ask you about sustainability. We saw a lot of that last year and continue to see that this year in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic, where they realized that there were some immediate things and investments that needed to happen, that they weren't necessarily saying how you're going to keep this going, but they realized it was something that needed to be addressed right then, like emergency assistance, like telecommunications equipment, because everything was going virtual, those types of costs. And so sustainability wouldn't be necessarily as much of an issue in those types of scenarios. Commonly requested attachments if you're a nonprofit organization, like take these documents, save them in a folder, have electronic copies of them, your 501c3 letter from your from the IRS, or your letters of incorporation that show what type of entity you're structured as, whether that's your LLC, if you're a for-profit, or corporation, whatever the case may be. Like, have a copy of that sort of incorporating document that will verify to the funder the type of entity that you are, so they can do an assessment of whether you meet their eligibility guidelines around the types of organizations that they fund. Your board of directors, like having that list of information of who sits on your board and sort of the role that they play within the community or the organizations or companies that they're affiliated with. And a really important thing to think about when it comes to your board of directors or your trustees is that they should also be fundraising for you. Like, they should be raising money. They should be helping you tap into resources. They should be making donations themselves to your organization. They are essentially ambassadors for the organization that you operate. And so they should be the first ones to step up and make a donation or contribution to your organization before they go out to solicit a dollar from anyone outside of your organization. And I know this one can be tough, because a lot of people are uncomfortable with asking for money. But if your board of directors aren't bringing dollars to your organization, or those individuals that consider themselves to be ambassadors for your organization aren't helping to bring dollars to your organization to help you connect with resources through their company, because they work for a company that they can help bring their company's resources to your organization, like, you might want to think about, who would be most effective serving on your board. I know sometimes we ask the people who are like friends of ours and closest to us because they're low-hanging fruit. However, just thinking strategically, like, do you have someone sitting on your board who has legal experience or expertise that can help advise you on legal matters concerning the operation of your organization? Someone with financial background and experience, someone with marketing experience that can help you in your branding and review your language for the materials that you put out, or your social media and things of that nature. And you want to make sure that you don't overstep the boundaries between what board members do and what staff does if you're in a 501c3 organization. But the board members should absolutely be helping you tap into resources. And that should be something that you should also clearly communicate as you're asking people to sit on your board is, are you willing to fundraise? Can you help bring resources? Like, sharing that as an expectation of their role and responsibility as a board member. Having your organizational operating budget. I know there was a session as part of this forum about documentation and record keeping, and it's so critical. I didn't get to watch that session, but I just know as a topic in general, whether it comes to securing loans, to securing funding as a for-profit business, or securing funding grants as a nonprofit organization, in every scenario, you're going to be asked for documentation in terms of your finances, your revenues, and your expenses. And, one of the things that we found when we worked with the client that we worked with in Georgia in terms of securing beginners, new and beginning ranchers, farmers and ranchers funding, is that they secured funding to provide technical assistance and capacity building to assist individual farmers around getting their documents in place, because it's particularly like when we were able to secure the Pickford settlement funds, again, that funding became available. We helped the organization tap into it, but in terms of the farmers being able to tap into it, it was all about receipts, right? It was all about the documentation that you could provide to document that you had actually suffered a loss, and whether that's, we can get into a debate about whether that's should have been the case or not. But what we know is that it was, and that the only way that you could tap into those funds was to be able to provide all of that documentation. And there were a lot of farmers who had suffered harm, but could not, unfortunately, tap into that funding because they hadn't kept the proper documentation to demonstrate their loss. And that's highly unfortunate. And, we can talk about equity and processes, but in terms of just what most funders' expectations and just for good business, in terms of knowing where you are as an organization, it's going to be just really important to stay on top of your finances. Audited financial statements can be something if you receive over, I think, $250,000 in federal funds, $750,000 in federal funds at any single grant period. You definitely have to do an audited financial statement. If you're a smaller grant organization, this isn't so much a requirement, but it just sort of depends on the size of the budget of your organization, how much federal dollars you're investing. And the larger your organization gets, the more sources of funding you have, the more you probably want to be thinking about moving towards and working with a CPA firm to conduct an annual financial audit for you. Letters of commitment and support, they are two different things. Letters of commitment are those who are partnering with you and making an investment in your operations, your program, your project. So if you're working, anyone can write a letter of support that basically says, hey, we really like this organization. They're doing a great job. They provide an essential service in our community. Please consider them favorably. Or what's much stronger is a letter of commitment saying, yes, all of those things are true that was said in the letter of support. And we invest in this organization through our partnership by giving them space or allowing the use of our van or whatever investment, or making referrals to this organization because we trust them with the clients that we serve, and so we refer our clients there. So someone who is actually making an investment with your organization can provide a much stronger letter that will support your request, as opposed to someone who just generally supports you but hasn't necessarily made an investment in your operations or your work. Everyone now is looking for equal opportunity. Policy statements of non-discrimination are just really important to have on hand, and that's a really important aspect of just sort of doing business and just doing good business. And then your resumes for your key staff and consultants, just sort of having those down to like condensed to 2 pages, because there's going to be a limitation often on how many attachments. So if you've got a 10-page resume or CV, like that's cool, but you want to make sure that you also sort of have a condensed version of your resume so that if it needs to be included in a grant application, like you can give them the short version as opposed to the very long, every single thing I've done in my career version that's going to take up too much real estate in your grant application, right? There's just sort of have one that hits the high points, and then you can have a much more detailed resume or CV for your staff or for any consultants that you might be working with around, subject matter experts or evaluation or any other activities that would be related, and you would rely on the expertise and knowledge of that individual for the funding.
I have a question.
Yes.
When it comes to letters of commitment or support, is there a minimum number that you find to be impactful? And is there a maximum number that above which they're like, seriously, is this all the...
Yeah, I would say it's one of those things that's subjective. One of the things that's going to be related to what the funder says about how many attachments you can include. And a lot of times they'll give you instructions like you can't exceed this many pages, or your file that you attach with those kind of attachments can't be larger than this. And so you sort of have to use that as a lens for just determining how much of that. A lot of people think the more the merrier, let's go out and secure like 20 letters of support. Like they really don't need that. That's overkill. Like think about who your key partners are. Also think about like your clients and, in terms of sort of, really compelling letters that you can secure, not just who are making investments or who you partner with, but those that have actually benefited from the work that you do and having that client write a letter. And so sometimes funders will make the distinction that you can only do commitment letters. And sometimes they may tell you, you know, and have at least 3 commitment letters from these type of partners where they got to lay out in their letter how they're working with you and be that specific. And then there are some funders that just have sort of general guidelines saying it's okay to include, and I just say use your discretion. You know, it's not good to go overboard with that, and just think about who can write the most powerful, compelling letters that really sort of hit home the impact of the work that you do. It's sometimes just think that quality is better than quantity.
Awesome, thank you.
Mm-hmm. The good, the bad, and the ugly qualities of well-written proposals, like consider the reviewer's perspective, right? And that's why early at the beginning of this presentation, I recommended like, you know, doing an exercise as a grant reviewer and like seeing how tough that project is and seeing how many people don't follow instructions. You know, like that's one of those sort of low-hanging things that you can very easily do, is that like the funder has given you a very specific outline of the information that they want you to include in your proposal. Follow those instructions, because you'll be surprised at the high percentage of people who don't. And so those are just ways that funders are easily able to screen you out, because they're like, you're just not even following the directions that we're giving you in terms of putting this request together. So basic things like that are really important. And if you think about it and put yourself in the reviewer's shoes, you know, you've written one proposal, that person may have 10, 20, 50 proposals. I mean, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, and when we worked on the Ryan White Title I program for HIV/AIDS services in our community, that one time of year when we solicited grants from all the providers over a 6-county area, we'd have like 50 applications that we received and had to read and make a recommendation around. Like each person who sat on that committee had to read that many proposals. So make sure that you're just using that lens to think about like how difficult this work can also be, and the easier that you can make their job in terms of writing something that's clear, concise, and to the point, and follows the instructions and uses good creativity. Like if you've got a bunch of data that you want to convey, like drop it in a table or use a graphic or illustration in terms of just a really narrative heavy proposal that someone has to sort through and interpret. Like anything that you can do to make that person's life easier is going to cause them to become an advocate for you when they review your proposal, to say, this was a really well-written proposal that was really easy to understand. The numbers make sense, the strategies make sense. This is something that we want to fund. Like it's that simple. And we have what's called the 12-12-12 rule, which is when you think about writing your proposal, imagine that the person who's going to be reading it, proposals for 12 hours, is reading your proposal at 12 o'clock midnight, and yours is the 12, you know, then they've been reading for 12 hours. Yours is the 12th proposal, and it's 12 o'clock midnight when they're reading it. And those are like some of the conditions, especially like when we were participating as federal peer reviewers, at least before the pandemic, they'd fly you into DC, put you up in a hotel, and basically hold you hostage, doing nothing but reading proposals for like 3, 4, 5 days, you know. And then, you know, not hostage in the sense that you weren't able to like go out and eat and, you know, at the end of the day, but essentially you were like sequestered in a room reviewing proposals all day, nothing else. And when you finally got to that proposal that was just really well written, followed the instructions, like did everything, you were just like, I really think this grant should be funded. And that's what it comes down to. Who is the person who's in the room that will read your proposal and then advocate it, saying this is really important work, and you know, this is something that you want to do. And I realized, like, for folks who are doing like agricultural work, like writing might not be your thing, and that's okay. Like if that's not your strength, then partner up with someone who is, that can help bring that expertise to the table for you, that can help you put together a quality document. You've got the expertise and knowledge. That other person has the sort of the expertise and quality in terms of crafting and designing a really well-written proposal, and figure out how you can work together with that person to put something together that really sort of creates a compelling argument for why a funder should be investing in helping you with your expenses. Qualities of well-written proposal include those that are just responsive to the guidelines and interests. And it doesn't mean you have to change your interests or activities to meet the funder's guidelines. It just means that you have to find the funder that's interested in funding the thing that you do, right? And again, going back to that research piece and why finding the funder who's compatible for what you do is so important to make sure that you are targeting the right audience in terms of who wants to fund what you do. Not everyone wants to, but there is someone who does, right? And typically more than one someone. It's just finding that right match. Keeping your proposals written in layman's terms, unless you're writing something that's highly technical that requires really like formal language, like keeping it in very easy to understand language, because you don't know who's sitting at the other end of the table that's going to be reading your proposal. There were times that we got into DC where so many people were supposed to come in. Maybe someone missed their flight. Maybe someone's flight got canceled. Maybe someone got sick at the last minute and couldn't come in as a peer reviewer. And then now they're on site looking for someone to fill in for that person and saying, hey, did someone come on this trip with you? Would that person be interested in serving as a peer reviewer? We're missing a person and we're looking for someone. Might there be someone with you who came and just was going to hang out in DC while you were reviewing grants? Can we recruit them? So that the person who's reviewing might not know anything about the subject area that you're attempting to address. Hopefully they do. Most program officers usually have a little bit of knowledge about a number of different things affecting their communities, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's so. And sometimes because of the work that we do, our lens can be so narrow that because we understand it so well, we forget that others don't understand it as well as we do. And a perfect example of that is we were working on a federal grant, reviewing grants for Office of Minority Health about grants to address health disparities. And there was an application from a applicant in the Southwest part of the country that was writing a request about funding doulas. Now, this was probably about 10 years ago. Right now, I think doulas sort of are coming to the contemporary language that sort of everybody's beginning to understand better and have at least heard of doulas and understand better the role of doulas. But at that time, like not a whole lot of people were talking about doulas. And so the person who was making the presentation for their proposal said, you know, this is a request for doulas. There were a bunch of blank stares in the room. And the person said, does everybody know what a doula is? And a lot of people raised their hand and said no. And so that person says, well, let me explain what a doula is. And then the program person from the federal agency stopped that person and says, is what you're about to say in the application? The definition that you're about to give, is it in the application? And if it's not, then you can enhance their proposal by explaining what it is, right? And so for that agency that probably works in day out with communities that are being served by doulas, it never even crossed their mind to say, should I stop? And maybe other people don't understand what this is. And maybe I need to give a definition of what a doula is and sort of their role in supporting pregnant and mothers and new mothers and things like that. And so just those little things can make the difference because, like, again, you can't guarantee that the person who's reviewing your application will understand the issues that you're presenting. And so the more data, the more definitions that you can give them, very simply put, the better off you are in terms of making sure that they have a full and proper context for your request. And then including the required attachments. Again, editing each submission for its current funder, making sure that your narrative in your written request is aligned with the expenses and things in your budget, using up-to-date data, particularly when it comes to things like census data, you know, the American Community Survey data, which is updated annually. Like, we're in 2021. You shouldn't be citing 2010 data on your census data unless you're trying to give like a historical context for how something has changed over the last 10 years. That would, or if 2010 data for a data element that you're citing is the most current data available, then it's okay to use that data and say, this is the most current data available. This is the most recent figure that we have on this information, so that they know it's not you leaving out 11 years worth of data, but it's something that's just not updated as frequently. And so conveying that will save you a lot of grief. Simple things like page numbering your application is, something that's basic, but that person who received, particularly if it's an electronic submission, or even if it's a hard copy submission, which we're not seeing so much of anymore, even if they submit you submit that person is typically going to take your copy and assign it to their administrative assistant or someone in their office who then has to take it and put it on a copier and make 10 copies of it for all the members of their review committee. Well, if your proposal happens to be the one that gets jammed in the printer, in the copier, and then that person has to be responsible for putting your proposal back in order, but you seem to have left off the page numbers, something like that could really sort of get your things out of order or end up with a page missing. So basic things like including formatting things like page numbers are really important. And then proposals that demonstrate collaboration. Like if you don't have partners, if others aren't wanting to collaborate and partner with you, you need to do sort of an internal check and say, what the heck is going on? Right. And so funders are going to want to see that others are going to want to work with you, that you want to work with others, that you play well with others, that you're not duplicating services in the community and doing what someone else is doing. And there are many organizations that do the same thing in the community. But the thing is, how is yours distinct? If that's the case. But you always be able to say when they ask you about your collaborations and partnerships, there ought to always be some organization, some entity, something that you can cite in that section of the proposal that says that others are going to want to work with you. If you can't, then you're going to want to make that a priority for your organization to say, who should our partners be? And not just partners for the sake of having a list of partners, but high quality partnerships that really just are logical and really make sense for the work that you do.
I have two questions for you.
Yes.
One question is, do you have or do you know of a resource where someone can find sample grant proposals specifically for farmers?
Yeah, if you go to the USDA website, a lot of times they'll have information that are cited, past successfully funded proposals that are cited there. I'd say do a simple Google search if you're looking for a specific program for under agriculture. Like a lot of times you'll just find some organization has put their successfully funded proposal out on the internet, or at least an abstract of their proposal that kind of gives you an overview of their project and tells you who they're funded by. So I'd say, a basic Google search of whatever funder you're looking at or funding source you're looking at and saying, successfully funded grant proposal for USDA or successfully funded grant proposal for whomever. Whatever program you're interested in, and see what comes up. And that's usually the easiest low-hanging way to start.
Awesome. Okay, so second question is, can we cite under audited census data in an appeal for a proposal for, say, redistricting research? Sorry, that was awful.
I was going to say, can you say that again?
Certainly can. So census data still needs to be audited or is still being audited. So would funders be receptive to that with redistricting research that's ongoing?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think you take the most current data for which is sort of established, right? Because I know there were a lot of issues around the 2020 data. Or things that are happening with redistricting. So what's the most common data that you have available that sort of everyone's in agreement that this is a good number? And then you can begin to talk about how that figure might be worse or it might be better based on these factors that we know, and sort of debate that's happening. And we actually saw that, not necessarily with redistricting data, but for those of you who are in Birmingham who remember, like a few years ago, there was a big issue with graduation rates being reported with Alabama State Department of Education, and them coming forward and saying, we acknowledge that the rates that we've been reporting is not reliable information. So then when we were working on grant applications where we had to be citing the graduation rates for local school districts, we had to put a footnote in the proposal saying, this year is the most current data that we have available. this data is not available for this time period based on what's currently happening in our community around the State Department acknowledging that this might not be accurate information. And so giving it context where you're giving some data, but also acknowledging and putting in references to any challenges to that data or things of that nature would be a way to communicate that to the funder.
Awesome, thank you. And just a time check, we are 10 minutes out.
Okay, great. Right on track. This is just a list of useful resources. Again, census data, independentsector.org is again the site that I gave earlier as having those standard rates that you can go to find travel reimbursement rates, lodging, per diem, independentsector.org is the hour of volunteer time. GSA is the website for those standardized federal rates related to private vehicles, per diem, lodging, things of that nature. GuideStar is where you can go and for free download a 990 form for any of your funders that you're interested in applying to. And within the US Census, I'd say just get familiar with that site because you will almost always be going there looking for some figure for your community, whether it's population, poverty rate, you name it. A really easy way, even though the census is only updated every 10 years, American Community Service data, I think, is every year, if not every 2 years, every other year. So like right now, if you go to the census website and go to Quick Facts, you'll find 2019 data for most communities, unless you're working in a really small rural community with a population of under 50,000, then even though it's going to show current data, it's probably going to be more reflective of the 2010 data. But just make sure that you go out there and see what that is so you know what those numbers are for the area that you serve. Other useful resources are reports generated by local foundations. If you go to the Community Foundation website, right, they've got publications of information that they publish that can help inform your proposal because you're giving their data back to them. So it also shows to them that you've done your due diligence for the information that they're producing and rolling that into the information that you're sharing. Reports issued by government agencies, the Foundation Center, and Googling, again, like I mentioned earlier, terms like best practices, evidence-based, evidence-formed, or even best practices toolkits. And for those of you who aren't aware, I do have a copy of my book, The Federal Grants Prep Guide, which is available as an ebook. I think we're out of hard copies now. I'm almost certain of it, but you can be purchased on Amazon. So I know we've got just a few minutes left, but I'm glad to answer any final questions that we might have in the last few minutes.
All right. Well, if there aren't any final questions.
I have one question. Sorry, Charlotte. I was just thinking about how to phrase it. I know you mentioned like volunteer hours, for example. You can count that, and I'm just thinking, do you have any favorite strategies or like applications or whatever for like how to track those things that are like really helpful for grants as like a really like small organization? I'm thinking about some that don't have any, it's like all volunteer based right now, like haven't received much funding. Yeah, just would love your thoughts on like ways through that, which is like manageable for like folks that don't get paid for it.
Yeah, I'd say, of course, it depends on the number of volunteers that you have coming in and out that are working with you. But for the, small operations with a relatively smaller number of volunteers, I'd say something as simple as a sign-in sheet where they have the time that they sign in and the time that they leave. And then you're just adding that up on a periodic basis, monthly. Then you can roll that into annual numbers that then say this is how many hours of volunteer time. There are some, other tools that you can use if it gets to a level that it's, it's so many people you can't necessarily keep track. So whether that's like having somebody who sort of gets assigned to you as a volunteer coordinator, or who's willing to volunteer as a volunteer coordinator for you, who can sort of handle that as a management responsibility, so that maybe even you do assigned scheduling where you've got blocks where you say, okay, we only do X number of hours, because managing volunteers is work too, right? Like it can sometimes take you off track with being able to do the things that you need to be doing, that you can just sort of get into the nuts and bolts of doing what you need to do. So, one other strategy could be, saying, oh, we only have volunteer hours on Saturdays from 9 to noon. I don't know, whatever the case may be. And then you just count the numbers of volunteers, and then, you've got 3 hours a week for each of those volunteers that would be coming in volunteering. So it doesn't have to be an overly complicated. Most funders probably aren't going to challenge you, as long as you've just sort of demonstrated that you've sort of got a system in place for how you track that information.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. Can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi. So I have a question about private or individuals, trying to collaborate with others that are grant seekers, say like the Birmingham Libraries. I know there's a lot of grant proposals going on that are ongoing there. And I was wondering when the next BPL board meeting is, and whether that would be a good time to like present ideas there.
For the Birmingham Library Board?
Yes.
Okay, that's a great question and a timely question. The Standing Library Board meeting is every second Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. And there's always a public comments portion at the beginning of the meeting. So if there's something that you want to present to the board, all you have to do is show up before the meeting starts and put your name on the sign-in list to make comments to the board. Usually those comments are limited to like 3 to 5 minutes, just for time's sake, and particularly if there are multiple individuals. But if you have suggestions about, wanting to partner with the board, I know we had a lot of citizen participation recently because there have been recommendations for closures in particular branches. Just anything that you wish to share. It's a standing monthly meeting every second Tuesday, 4:30 p.m., typically at the downtown branch. We were doing meetings virtually because of COVID, but that emergency order by the governor has lapsed. And so all meetings are back in person at the downtown library. And then you can also check the library website for all of their meetings, not just the board meetings, but the committee meetings. All of them are subject to the open meetings law. And so all of those meetings have to be publicly advertised at least 3 days in advance of the meeting date. And most of those committees now also have standing meeting dates, which are also open to the public. And so anytime you care to show up, you're welcome as a member of the public to do so.
Okay. I was having some trouble finding online where those meetings dates were. I see the general public meetings, but as for the others, those are, for me, I couldn't
And
find
I'd say if there's any question, the contact information, so just reach out directly to the administrative office and ask them, and they keep a calendar and they'll be able to tell you when any of the upcoming meetings. The committees don't always meet every month. It just depends on if they have something on their agenda. So if there's, in terms of upcoming meetings, if there's nothing on the agenda, then you may not see a meeting for one of the committees. But the board meeting is every month, 12 months a year. There are no meetings, there are months that are skipped. Always on the second Tuesday. Sometimes they'll rotate meetings just to move out to like twice a year, up to twice a year. It can roll out to other library branches, but they'll give advance notice of that, and it will still be on the second Tuesday at 4:30.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all those questions, and big round of applause for Kim. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and all this information with us. Give some love in the chat, y'all, please. And I just want to talk a little bit about ASAN membership to take us out. This year, ASAN has deepened our commitment to being a values-driven, farmer-centric, member-led grassroots organization. We are strengthening our collective muscles to address the most pressing challenges farmers and aspiring farmers are facing: access to capital, access to land, environmental threats, and so many more. To do this work, we have been undergoing a membership scale-up to build the just and resilient food system we all desperately need, which our children's children deserve. And we need farmers and non-farmers to link together to demand and create change. And I have exciting news, which is that we have, I think Mars said today, 60 new members since this summer. So it's really exciting. We've been really growing, y'all. So thank you so much. And there's a place for you in this movement. So please become a member today, and you'll see the membership chat in the chat, the membership link in the chat. Well, thank you all so very much. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you.
And y'all have a great day.
Bye.
Bye.